Do we have translation and interpretation this evening?
We don't, Commissioner. It wasn't requested.
I did not request it. That is right. So I should know that. Thank you for clarifying.
You're welcome.
Why don't we wait just another moment and maybe we'll plan to get started around 5:02.
Okay.
All right. Good evening.
Recording in progress.
Good evening, everyone. Why don't we get started and call the Augmented Rules, Policy, and Legislation Committee to order. And I see that we have our two other commissioners here, Commissioner Alexander and Vice President Lamb. We don't have to take roll call, do we? We can just notice them.
Yeah, just note who's there.
Okay, why don't we jump into our agenda? We have 3 action items and 1 informational item. And so I will pass it over to district staff to introduce the first item.
Thank you, Commissioner Chair Bogus. For anybody who is listening, my name is Myung Lee, and I'm the Deputy Superintendent of Policy and Operations for SFUSD. And I'm stepping in with my fabulous colleague, Hongmei Pang, who is also going to be working a lot with this committee and government relations, in addition to her previous focus and ongoing focus on communications, as I believe we've informed all the commissioners. And so Hongmei and I are going to be tag teaming in supporting the work of this committee as staff liaisons. And for my part, I just want to say up front, I apologize, but I'm going to be stepping away from tonight's meeting for an interval due to a commitment to speak at a class. But Hongmei and I, again, will share duties tonight, and we may have a couple of other staff members join during the course of the meeting. So thank you so much, commissioners. We're excited to be here and talk about a number of important topics. And we also have Abe Hajela, who is a frequent contributor to these meetings. And Abe is gonna present the first action item about the legislative overview. And I think that will take take the form of 2 parts. One is to provide an orientation of the general role that Abe and his colleagues at Capital Advisors play on our behalf, representing our interests and the interests of the committee regarding legislative affairs, especially in Sacramento. And then also run through bills of interest that are posted on board docs. So specific bills that have been introduced, and then comment on positions that the committee may wish to take. And also included in that, I believe, will be commentary about the budget related issues shaping up in Sacramento. So with that, I will pass it over to Mr. Hajela.
Thank you very much. And thank you, commissioners, for having me. So let me talk first more broadly about the work we are doing and how it interacts with what the committee does. So there's 2 fundamental things I think it's our job to do for the district. One is to make sure we're doing everything we can to secure state funding and support for the school districts and the kids and families you serve, right? So that tends to be more work related to the budget than legislation. As many of you know, over the past couple decades, the state has really shifted how it does things, and almost all of the big policy issues and all the big programs related to education are handled during the budget process, and less is handled through sort of bills and legislation than it used to be. Of course, the budget's a bill too, but that's a slightly different process. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is to make sure we influence legislation that may impact the school district. And on that, we operate by coming to this committee, showing you the bills that are out there, getting your direction generally for what we ought to be doing, and then going through specific bills and saying, is this one we might want to support or oppose or that sort of thing. So of course, those two things are interrelated. Some of the issues that are budgetary issues also are handled in legislation and vice versa. So that's kind of from the biggest picture. And then over the last few years, I think we've tried to refine the way we do things a little bit with Rules Committee, and I think made some advancements that are helpful under the guidance of some of the folks that are here today, including the commissioners that have chaired in the past. So for example, we now have a set of priorities that kind of guides our work. So rather than taking one bill at a time, we've sort of set some broad priorities. So, and as a generalization, to describe those priorities, I'd say the first one is, secure core funding for the school district, for the students you serve. So I think of that as LCFF funding, right? Do everything we can to maximize that. Special education based funding, right? Because that's the core funding that we have to support our special ed kids. So that's one of the main priority. Related to that is mitigate loss of funding from enrollment declines, right? And ADA disruptions. So again, if we can correct for those things, we secure more base funding. And then also related to that, one of your priorities is to support your teachers and staff, right? You want to be able to hire more teachers. You want to hire more qualified teachers. You want to provide support and training for them. And so I think of all of those three things broadly as related together. And what we have to do to address those is increase core funding and adjust for the loss of ADA. So let me talk briefly about some of the things we've done in that area, just as a quick overview. One of the main things we're doing is we're forming a coalition with other urban school districts, and we're working together on these issues. So we sent a letter to the governor highlighting these core issues, and we're going to go ahead and translate that into letters and meetings with key legislators that are the main players on the budget, and try to influence them to see things our way. So fortunately, between San Francisco and LA and some of our other districts, we have lots of the key members of leadership. We've been working with San Diego, of course, there's Pro Tem Atkins there. So there's a lot of folks having alliances with San Diego, LA, the other urban districts, Oakland, is very helpful to our cause. And so we've been doing that. We're also exploring getting the mayors from the major cities to support the asks of the districts. We understand that mayors and cities have different interests in school districts. They're not always aligned. But on some of these issues, core funding for our kids, funding for special ed, we actually think those interests are aligned. And so we're hoping to do that, to sort of, in some cases, it turns out that the city has a better relationship with a certain legislator than the school district does. So let's use that to our advantage. And at the same time, we've offered to the cities where there are issues of common interest, we would do the same. We'll try to be helpful to them. All right, so that's one of the things, and I'll talk about as we get to some bills, some of the things we're doing there. But just as an example on LCFF, what we're really trying to urge the governor and the legislature is to take at least half of the growth in Prop 98 in ongoing funding, which is a lot of growth this year. Put that into core funding for school districts so that the money comes to you and you can actually do things like hire staff, right? And you can improve programs in your schools, as opposed to creating lots of new categorical programs, some of which are very good, right? But they don't always meet the needs of the districts. We'd rather have you prioritize what you'd like to do with the money than have the state do that. Let me mention a few other priorities. So along with the core funding, the district has asked us to look at rising pension costs and whatever we can do to have the state help with that. Early care and early education support for that. And there's a number of budget asks from last year and this year related to that. Support for at-risk and low-income students. I'm going to talk about a couple bills that are relevant to that. That also feeds into support for LCFF, because remember, LCFF already takes care of, has a built-in adjustment for equity, right? So that we provide additional funding for low-income English learner, foster youth, homeless youth, et cetera. And then finally, something that I've talked to Commissioner Lamb about many times, support for connectivity, which was obviously so important when we're doing remote learning, but will continue to be important, whatever sort of mode of learning we're in the future. So those were some of the broad priorities. I think it's super helpful that the commissioners have given us that broad guidance so it can sort of focus what we do on the bills and which bills we bring you, and also what we do on the budget. So that's the big overview. And then I can talk about, so on the bills process, we're at the very beginning of that for 2022 for this new legislative session. Bills were introduced. I provided two different lists of bills. One is a very long list of all of the active K-12 education bills we're tracking. Absolutely did not expect you to read through that and look through the whole thing, but it's just so you have the entire list. What I will do then at the meetings, subsequent meetings, is start to select some of the bills that we think are the most important. Bring those to you. You tell me what you think of them, whether you want to support or oppose, and then also be available to hear from you. Yeah, those bills are fine, but there's these other ones we're interested in that you didn't mention. And then we can start looking at those. So we're very early in the process. I don't think it's important to take a lot of positions in this particular meeting. And I know you have a pretty long agenda. The taking positions on bills, those meetings take quite a lot of time. So maybe we want to schedule for the next meeting a more thorough review of which bills we ought to support and oppose. But I did want to, and I'll stop in a second to make sure I'm doing what you want me to. I do want to briefly go through the bills of interest and pick a few of those out, mention to you. These are the sort of bills that we think are hottest this year, and get your take on a couple of them that we might be ready to support already. So Commissioner Bogus, do you want me to start going through that list, or do you want me to stop, take questions or comments at this point?
I think because of public comment, it'll make sense for us to just have you continue, and then we'll take public comment, clarifying questions from commissioners, and we'll take full questions from the commissioners and kind of have a full discussion. Okay,
terrific. Thank you. So on the bills of interest, let me just point out a few, and when I'm done, absolutely happy to go through any others that all of you think you want to talk about. At the top of page 2, SB 70 by Senator Rubio. Wanted to mention that is a bill that is a carryover from last year, and this committee has taken a support position on this bill already. This is the mandatory kindergarten bill. Full disclosure, someone's carried this bill for about 8 years in a row and it's not been successful, but it's something that we've been plugging away on. So that's a bill that you already have a position on. If it changes, the bill changes in any fundamental way, or if this committee wants to reconsider it, we would be happy to bring it back. Lower on that same page, there's a number of school finance bills that are worth talking about. The first two, they're all by Merit Suchi, AB 1607 and AB 1609. Those have to do with the mitigating for enrollment or ADA loss issues. AB 1607 is essentially very similar to the governor's proposal to allow districts to take not only your better of current year or prior year ADA, but if you're in declining enrollment, if it's better for you, you can take the average of your last 3 prior years ADA. That's particularly helpful to folks in this next coming year, because remember, that means you would be taking your 1920 ADA, which was pre-pandemic. So it's before significant ADA loss and enrollment loss. The next year we had a hold harmless. So you didn't lose any ADA. So you could take that. And then this year, unfortunately, you would have to average in if there was loss of ADA or loss of enrollment, but that is significantly better than current or prior year. So I'm not suggesting that you take a position on either of these bills right now, because I fully expect this to be handled in the budget rather than in a bill. But it is useful just to be aware that, you know, if you are all supportive of these measures to try to do anything we can to, you know, allow SFUSD to use the highest number possible for your ADA. That's not relevant to the current year, it's for the budget year. So for the next year coming, that's what lots of us have heard about is the fiscal cliff, when you actually have to recognize the loss of enrollment and loss of ADA could be a major issue for many districts. So those bills 1607 and 1609 are important to watch. And if they morph and change, if it looks like they're going to become the vehicle, I would certainly let you know. But right now, my sense is this will be handled through the budget. AB 1614 is the first bill that I will suggest that we might want to come back at the appropriate time in this meeting and perhaps support this bill. This is the bill that Assemblymember Maritsuchi has carried for a couple of years to try to increase the base grant levels of LCFF to get closer to the national average. That has been a goal of California since we adopted Prop 98 in 1988. We've never gotten close to it. For many years, we were in the bottom half of funding. Actually, we're in the bottom 10th of funding. We have improved a little bit over time, but we're still a long way from the national average. You know, full disclosure, this is an aspirational bill. It doesn't actually appropriate the money, but by increasing the LCFF targets, the base grant that we're shooting towards, making it closer to the national average, what it means is that over the next 10 years or so, rather than spend the money on whatever is the, you know, the favorite flavor of the month in Sacramento, they would actually put the money into LCFF, which is core funding for you. And I think that's advantageous. So at the appropriate time, maybe we could come back to that one and consider it for support. I would say the same thing for the bill on the next page, AB 1948 by your Assembly Member Ting. This bill, the idea behind this bill is we've always had unduplicated count, which means if a student is both, you know, low income and English learner, they don't get funded twice for those categories, right? You only get funded once. So if you're only an English learner, or if you're both English learner and low income, you still only get funded once for your supplemental and concentration grant. This bill wants to adjust that, at least for foster youth and homeless, and say, look, there really is a difference between being just low income and having the additional challenge of being a foster youth or homeless. So the idea is to make those duplicated counts, meaning you would get 2 supplemental grants if you were both low income and foster youth or low income and homeless. So that's the idea of the bill. It would also, it's also getting towards changing the definition of low income. We'll have to explore that a little bit more. Getting away from eligibility for free and reduced lunch, which if we switch to universal meals, everybody's eligible and it becomes less relevant, and moving towards a poverty-based index, so 250% of the federal poverty rate. We'll have to explore whether that works or not, but that's if the commission supports the idea of duplicated funding for foster youth and homeless, that might be a bill that's worth supporting. And I can when we come back to these bills, give a brief description of them again. The other bills, just to keep an eye on, I'll just mention a few, and then others can let me know. On page 4, SB 1906 by Portantino on the firearms. This is going to be extremely controversial. It would ask school districts to require parents to disclose if they have firearms in the house and that students may have access to them. I see all kinds of problems with this in terms of the role of schools and whether this is the game you want to be in, and liability if you can't, follow through with it. It seems like it's got a lot of red flags in it. Long way to go. I'm not sure where this bill will end up, but I just wanted to flag it for you. On page 5, AB 2598 by Keela Weber. This is to develop state standards on restorative justice practices. I know that's an issue that this committee has been interested in the past. We've supported a number of bills related to restorative justice. So that's one that I think we might want to support. It would create an advisory body and try to come up with model best practices to be used around the state. And it's something that I think actually some of the expertise that's resides in the district could be used to help that committee. And then SB 387, it is similar to bills we've supported in the past. It's a Portantino bill related to training for youth mental and behavioral health issues. So that's one we probably want to keep a close eye on. And then on page 6, not suggesting we take a position on these right now unless the commissioners want to, but the 2 vaccine related bills are also likely to be very contentious. So there's a bill by Senator Wiener, your senator, to allow minors above the age of 12 to consent to vaccines, even if the parents don't. They don't require parental consent for that. And then SB 871 is the bill by Senator Pan to make the COVID vaccines part of the mandatory vaccines that students have to come to school. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of conversation along those. So those are the ones, again, I know you have a pretty busy agenda today. So those are the ones I wanted to highlight quickly, and happy to take any questions or comments on those.
Thank you so much for your presentation and covering that for us. Are there any clarifying questions from commissioners before we go to public comment? Commissioner Alexander?
Just real quick, Abe, I really appreciate that. As always, your detailed and thorough overview, but at the proper level, not too high level, but not too detailed. So thank you. Just a quick question on SB 70. Can you just kind of explain what the rationale was in that? Because that was interesting to me. I don't think we talked about that last year, and I was just curious because it didn't seem like a no-brainer to me. The one on kindergarten requirements. So I was just curious what the rationale was for supporting it.
Good, and I better double check because I could have sworn I didn't look at my notes that I'd taken a position on that last year. So let me double check that to make sure.
I could be wrong, but
yeah, no, it's absolutely important to check. So the rationale there is, I think it's always been interesting that that kindergarten is not mandatory. And so we understand that, there are parents that do and don't want to send their kids to kindergarten. But as we do this hard push towards TK, right, and to try to design a system around kids coming in, at 4, the reality is you still don't even have to come in at 5. Some kids could be coming in closer to 6 years old. And many assembly members and senators have, over the past few years, have said that doesn't make much sense to me. So Shirley Weber was a big champion of this before. She said, before we figure out preschool and TK, shouldn't we make sure at least kindergarten's mandatory? And isn't it unfair to our first grade teachers if most of the students are coming in with 2 years and yet you have some students that haven't had any formal education? So that's the general idea behind it. I also think there's a fair amount of research indicating that the results are obviously better. Now, I think I don't know what the percentage is, but a very high percentage of parents send their kids to kindergarten anyway. So it's a low percentage of folks that don't. And, maybe the tweener is a program that strongly encourages parents and gives them more information and gets them to do that. I don't know in San Francisco what the percentage of parents that don't take advantage of kindergarten is, but I imagine it's low. So anyway, that's
no, that's one reason I was curious. I thought it was already really high. So anyway, thank you.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Vice President Lamb.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks, Abe, for your presentation. I have a couple of clarifying questions, and Chair Bogus, if they are too in the weeds of discussion, feel free to put your arm up or your hand up. I wanted to just tagging on earlier learning, SB 976. I'm curious around Abe, just high level, or is it, have we seen any details? And I didn't look at it, the legislative digest, but of universal preschool. What is the intent here of the bill?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question because I don't know either. I need to review it again because this game, as you know, has been entirely handled in the budget process. And Assemblymember McCarty has a number of times carried a bill to try to kind of put a marker out and influence the process, but then we end up doing it in the budget. So I apologize. I'll need to talk to the Assembly member and see what he is attempting to accomplish here. And how it's different from what's already being done under the budget.
That's great. I think just because, it is still very confusing between universal preschool as a framework of mixed delivery systems for local municipalities, let's say in the city and county of San Francisco. And then we have transitional kindergarten, which is a piece of the universal preschool. So just trying to be really accessible with language to families, because there's a lot of confusion. Yeah. There's a lot of confusion even with family childcare providers in the city. Just trying to understand, like, how do we navigate this moving forward as transitional kindergarten is expanding through a traditional school district like ours. So would love to just kind of learn a bit more about some of the vision there and how that does that complement the governor's administration and so what they've been putting forward around universal preschool.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think it is a really important issue because as they are encouraging folks to go to TK, they're not taking away the preschool option. So you have both systems, alive and well right now. And I know particularly in the city of San Francisco, preschool has been very successful in a lot of places. And so the question is, do you want to abandon that for TK? Do you want to shift kids over? I do think the long-term, and I know you already know this, the long-term vision is the more kids you serve through TK, the more it opens up preschool to get down to 3-year-old kids, right? So that's the long-term vision, but it'll take a while to get there.
Yeah, and I think just to be able to speak, for the public that, San Francisco has a unique opportunity and position because voters approved the little Proposition C, and that we comparatively to any other municipality in the country now have the largest investment. So, how are we as a city and county, along with the school district, really looking at exactly growing the overall supports for families and affordable childcare towards universality, frankly. And so just excited to really bring that alignment between the district and the city and the county in our first 5 as well. Second clarifying question, Chair Bogus, if you just entertain me, around AB 2806. I'm curious then, why has it failed 8 years in a row, and some early indications of what has kind of gotten caught up? I'm assuming appropriations, but would love to hear that.
I'm trying to find out what page I'm supposed to be on.
It's page 3, the Rubio bill, page 1.
The Rubio bill. I'm sorry, that's the mandatory kindergarten. Yeah, I don't.
No, that's the child care and supplemental reimbursements rate. Did I hear that correctly?
So
AB 2806.
Oh, 2806. Okay, I don't think that's the one that I said it has failed 8 years in a row. I'm sorry.
Maybe
I was. Yeah, I think I was talking about the mandatory kindergarten bill.
Got it. Okay. Great. That's all my questions for now.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for answering our clarifying questions. I think at this time, we will see if we have any public comment, and we will give commenters 2 minutes.
Okay, if you'd like to speak to this item, can you please raise your hand? Seeing 2. Michelle?
Yes, hello. Thank you so much. Michelle Jacques-Menegas here with the Parent Advisory Council to the Board of Ed. Forgive me, I wasn't quick enough in my note taking to note the bill numbers and all that, but I will talk about the primary goals. Very, very interested in this idea of being able to do the duplicate count for our students who need additional support, because I'm pretty sure we're providing supports for them in all the areas that they're identified and not just one. So it would be nice to be able to get that, not just for our foster youth and our youth experiencing homelessness, but all of our students that are in those categories. So thank you for that. Very interested as well in this change to move away from the qualification of free and reduced meals to a, I think you called it a poverty index, and especially want to keep an eye on that percentage of the federal poverty rate, because as we know, the cost of living here in San Francisco far, far exceeds that. So that's exciting. Very interested in the restorative justice practices bill, especially this idea of creating an advisory body that could model best practices. That could be so helpful in a much more consistent implementation of restorative practices. So thank you for that. And also on the training for youth mental health services. As we know, we need more of that, and being able to have folks who are trained specifically in how to work with our youth would be fantastic. And then the vaccination ones are very interesting as well. I love this idea of youth consent. We have a lot of our kiddos, young adults who want to consent for themselves on things and can't because of parents, and also making the COVID vaccine part of our required panel for students. Thank you very much.
Matt?
Hi, I'm Matt Kellerman, parent of a high school student at Ruth Asawa School of the Arts. Calling in tonight primarily just to say thank you for, Abe, what you described as the focus of efforts this year to pay attention primarily to legislation that could help defray some of the budgetary impacts we're facing. As a school site council member, our principal's done a really good job of describing how we've been protected for a couple of years from the impact of enrollment declines. The fall feels really hard, the fall we're about to experience coming in from into next year. And so anything that the district can do to really focus its advocacy efforts at the state on mitigating that, I would personally put above any other legislation that comes down the pike. It really should be 95. I know we can walk and chew gum at the same time, but it should be 95% of our advocacy efforts is to try to mitigate those reductions to schools. Thanks very much.
That's it, Commissioner.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the public for providing comment and being here. Are there any other questions or comments or thoughts from commissioners? I think it might be best for us not to take action tonight, but I think I'm open if someone feels really well moved, motivated to suggest something, but I would love for us to be able to come back. Let's start with Vice President Lamb, and then I will provide comment, and then we'll see who else has comments.
I appreciate the public comments, so thank you so much. And on that thread, Abe, around the school finance, I know it is top of mind for everyone in this committee as well as the entire board. And curious, I know there's no reading the crystal ball, but what do you anticipate as the budget has been the space where a lot of the details have gotten, finalized in the final sprint of the session. I don't need to preach to the, to my colleagues here, but it also feels like this is a statewide issue. It is a state of California issue. While certainly, locally and in the region, we might focus on, the drop in student enrollment. So it really does feel like there needs to be a systemic solution statewide. And that for me, I won't list my positions too explicitly, but it just feels like, getting us closer and closer to the realities of Prop 98 and reaching that national average, increasing through, our infrastructure thus far, like the local control funding formula, to me, is going to be really important. Certainly the student enrollment, while appreciating, enrollment versus daily attendance, it really, to me, doesn't go at the crux of what is being experienced by school districts, of what we opened up our meeting with, right? Around what it's going to take to really, around the learning loss recovery, around the social emotional learning, that's really going to be years and years of this. And so I certainly hope that the state legislature the governor's office, administration and office is really taking a deep look into if these investments don't go in now, what is lost, not only for our children and their learning, but overall for the state of California, what it means long-term into the 21st century, deepening as we go further into the 21st century, around the overall education and financial health, frankly, of the state. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, I'm actually, I'm pretty hopeful that we're going to do significantly better than where we were in the governor's January budget. And remember, the January budget's pretty good. It includes, a 5% COLA, 5.3% COLA. It included another $500 million for special ed base funding. It had money for a number of other programs. So it was pretty good. It wasn't quite as good as we had hoped. And it included a proposal to somewhat mitigate the loss of ADA and enrollment by doing the 3-year average. Here's why I'm hopeful. So the numbers after January, when we collected our tax receipts, we are still way above the numbers that the governor took. You might remember that before the budget came out, I had said we were in really good shape because I was looking at the LEO projections from November. Those projections still look to be accurate. And so by the end of January, according to the legislative analysts' assessment, we are likely to be at least $15 billion above where the governor had us in state general fund revenue. If we're 15 billion above, and this is just from the main 3 sources of taxes, personal income tax, sales and use tax, and corporation tax. If we're anywhere close to that, and I think we might be above the 15 billion, remember education, K-12, K-14 gets 40% of that. So in addition to everything the governor did, I'm thinking we're going to have another $6 billion to allocate. And so we're pushing the legislature really hard to say, use the accurate numbers. There is a need right now related to all of what kids have been through in the last couple of years, right? If you have this money, don't hold on to it. You might remember Jerry Brown underestimating tax revenues every year to hold the money in reserve. It's time to get that money out the door. If we have another $6 to $7 billion in K-14, we can do everything the governor asked for and the legislature, plus significantly increase LCFF funding, special ed funding, and probably do something related to pension costs as well. So that's why I'm feeling pretty hopeful. And I will say everybody's kind of rowing in the same direction on this. We're working with CTA, CFT, all of the statewide management groups, other districts, and everybody's pushing for the same thing. Give the districts the money through LCFF, special ed, and ADA protection, and then let the districts figure out what to do with it, because you all have the same sort of core problems, but you want to address them in different ways. LA might have different ideas than San Francisco and San Diego.
Thank you for that. Commissioner Vice Lamb, did you have any more questions? Or are you good?
I think I'm good for now, but maybe just, one other plug. We hadn't discussed it in the bills tonight, but I'm curious, perhaps it's kind of folded into the school financing discussions, but really how do we as a state, again, this is impacting all of us throughout the state, around stabilizing the workforce and really the opportunities to, bringing in new educators, keeping our educators, as well as our staff, frankly, to keep the most robust of our systems running as smooth as possible. So just wanted, you don't have to answer that right now, but just something I'm kind of also watching.
I mean, it's a great question and we're all struggling with it, but you're right. It's a problem across the workforce. If it was just about teachers, we could come up with some clever ideas, but it seems like it's generally across. And I think people are really looking at that carefully, because the outcomes are not what we expected. As we were coming out of the pandemic, we thought things would turn around rapidly, and but we're still seeing these labor force issues.
Thank you. Commissioner Alexander, please.
Thank you. Yeah, this relates to both of the topics that Vice President Lamb was just addressing. So Abe, I've also heard, I really appreciate that update on the may revise, or what we're thinking may happen. I have also heard something about the COLA increasing, is that the same thing basically, that would be a way of using that money?
Yeah, so okay, there's two things in that I'd like to unpack. One is that the COLA amount is based on a federal index, and it's not final yet. It's going to be final soon. We expect that to be closer to 6% than the 5.5%. So that's one thing. But the other thing that you're mentioning, I think, is important, is that a number of legislators, and CTA is sort of in between here. They're not sure where they want to end up being, I think, would, rather than saying we're increasing the LCFF base amount, they want to just say we're going to give you a super COLA of 10%, right, or 12%. Effectively, it kind of does the same thing. So I'm okay with it as long as it's money to the school districts that's flexible. The issue really is when you give it as a super COLA, it creates this assumption that that's the money that's available for things like salary raises and stuff like that. And that can be problematic because it can eat up the entire money you have and not leave enough for programs or services or to solve other fiscal issues that the district might be having. So, I mean, I'm for, any way that we can increase the amount of discretionary money that comes to the district is good. I prefer calling it an increase to the base grant. If we call it a COLA, as long as everybody understands what it is, it's okay. It is true that in the past we did that way a couple times. We provided what was called a super COLA.
Yeah. And do you have any sense, again, I know these are really, really rough numbers, but of the scale of what that would mean for SFUSD? I know that one time Deputy Superintendent Lee said he uses a rough calculation of about 1%.
I still think that's about right. So if we're talking $6 billion, then I see hopefully about 1% of that flowing to SFUSD. So we want to push to get the greatest amount of that money as possible being in LCFF and special ed.
Yeah.
Because the problem is you can really quickly eat up $6 billion in 3 or 4 new categorical programs. And that's what we want to avoid. I should say one caveat to that, to the extent that the district supports it, it will cost some money to handle that duplicated versus unduplicated issue. So if we're going to provide extra funding for students who are in more than one category, then that'll use some of that money, but that'll be a smaller amount.
And part of the reason I'm asking is because I think one of the issues I've heard coming from parents and school staff is that we're actually engaged in a budget cutting process at school sites right now. And some of that is enrollment based, cutting teacher classrooms based on reduced enrollment, which I think everyone agrees we need to do. But the cuts at schools actually go beyond that. So a school may then have to reduce a social worker or a literacy specialist. And one of the concerns I've heard is, well, if the May revise looks great, then we actually don't need to make those cuts. So what would you recommend? I mean, should we be doing a 2-tiered process or having our schools kind of make priorities for restoration?
Yeah, this is an ongoing challenge with the way the state budgets and the way you have to budget. So, and it's better than it used to be, because it used to be that they didn't even have a final budget by July 1. Sometimes their negotiations went into August and September. And yet you all have to develop your budget through the year and finalize it by July 1, which means you have to guess at how much money the state's going to have. I don't have a good solution for this other than I think good budgeting practice these days is to have more than one budget based on more than one scenario. So here's what we're going to do if funding stays the way it was proposed in the January budget. And then here are the things we'd like to do if more money comes in. I imagine retain staff, right, and do other things. And then here's what we'll do if, unfortunately, funding drops below the level we expected in January. So between you and me, I don't think you have to worry about that dropping below January very much. Right now, it's either going to be January or above. I think it does make sense to have contingencies for that. Unfortunately, the way the process works, you have to send off layoff notices before you know how much money you're going to have.
Right.
And that's incredibly disruptive. It's a terrible system, but it's the one the state gave us.
Right.
So,
no, absolutely. And I think I just want to make sure that our schools have that we collectively have a plan to how to quickly retract those notices and get the people back, the ones that we can. Again, there may be still some adjustments we need to make around classroom teachers, but so maybe it looked like Deputy Superintendent Lee had to step out, but maybe I will work with him through the budget committee and think about that if we, as a next step in terms of a process for ensuring that we have kind of a plan for that. And so that school communities know that that when they submit their budgets, they should also be saying, you know, if we get this additional funding, here are our priorities for.
Commissioner Alexander?
He's froze.
Okay. We'll give him maybe a second to see if he can unfreeze. If not, we'll go forward and come back to him.
Okay.
You're back, Commissioner Alexander?
Yeah, I think I went into an internet freeze zone. All your beautiful faces froze on my screen. I don't know what happened, but yeah, I was done anyway. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the presentation. I really appreciated the information and kind of how it's broken up on the things that we're focused on, really hearing about the efforts to increase funding for our districts and students across the state. One thing I'm really interested in figuring out, and I think maybe me and my fellow commissioners can have more conversations, but what does it really look like to activate our school community to really support some of our legislative pushes and really figure out even if there's a way to involve our students, which are our maybe best champions for advocating with legislators to make these changes. So it's really excited about that and really excited to figure out how we can support and bringing in more revenue to the district. One thing that is not one of our existing priorities, but is, I think, a priority for me, and I would love for us to kind of weigh in on the state, is really around issues of school discipline, moving away from the use of suspension and really kind of moving away from punitive discipline practices. And just really figuring out how we can support the state and kind of matching some of the approaches and steps that we've already taken. So I really feel like that is an area that we lead in the state, and it'd be great to see the state match us and then give us money for being such good leaders. I think that's all that I really have to add or offer up at this time. Abe, did you want to respond or add anything else?
No, I think that's right. And I think I appreciate that. And yes, so in addition to the restorative justice bill, I think there are going to be other efforts out there related to student discipline, and I'll make sure I keep my eye out for them. And then I think, yes, if the committee would like to do it that way, we can at the next meeting sort of dig in and start taking positions on some of these bills. And even at that point, I think we're going to want to, you know, really hone the list down. So it's not taking positions on 20 or 30 bills, but maybe, you know, 5 to 15, because that's the way we can be the most effective, you know, and really push hard on the bills that you think are the most important.
No, that sounds great. And I mean, if it's okay with other commissioners, I would love to maybe try to figure out if there's 5 or so that jump out to us as the most urgent is kind of a place to start, and then kind of have that be kind of the platform that we use to kind of build off of. But thank you so much. That sounds like a great path forward for us.
Great. Thanks, commissioners. Appreciate it.
Okay, and I think with that, we will close this item and transition to our next informational item regarding transitional kindergarten. And I will direct this to the staff who is leading this item.
Thanks, Chair Bogus. So just as a reminder to commissioners, your policies come to you a couple of different ways. So one, we might have an issue bubbling up that we think we need to address. So you've seen several times that we've brought independent study to you because of what's been going on with the pandemic. Another way that it happens to come to this policy team to review and revise is that CSBA makes recommendations to us to update or add policies based on changes in the law. So the 2 policies that you have on for tonight are coming to you because CSBA has made several recommendations. So we're starting to catch up on policies that changed last year, as well as policies that are coming out this year. And you're going to start seeing more of these come to the board and to the Rules Policy Legislation Committee. So the TK policy is coming because last year the legislature adopted AB 130, which does a number of things with respect to TK, but essentially it implements a gradual time span for mandatory TK admittance, so that by the time 25-26 school year comes around, children who turn 4 by September 1st will be eligible for TK. So it's slowly rolling back the timeline, and it does some other things as well with respect to the program. But I will stop there and ask if there are any questions.
Do we have any clarifying questions from commissioners? I have one. Could you talk a little bit about what is the normal timeline for us to kind of update these policies, and kind of when they are kind of the recommended changes kind of based off better language versus like a change in the law, kind of how we handle both approaches and kind of the time to address them?
Yeah, so I can walk you through sort of how we logistically do it. So when we get the CSBA recommendations, I tend to review them first, and I'll assign them out to the attorneys who support that policy area. I ask them to read it and decide, is this a recommended policy? Is this not making substantive changes, so it's not really worth the board's time? Or because some of them are just, updating language or really pretty technical. And also I ask them to prioritize it if they think it's something we need to address right away. But eventually they'll all come to you. It's just a matter of getting them through the system. So once we decide that those policies need to be updated, we look at it, we recommend what we know based on our own practices in SFUSD, and then we share it with, excuse me, just a second. Sorry about that. I'm home quarantining and they're not used to me working from home anymore. So once they sort of get in the queue, we revise them and then we send them out to staff. So this policy has been reviewed by, for example, by Chief Yashar. We ask them for their comments and changes, and then they make it to your board agenda. So I wish I could say as soon as CSBA issues their update these 20 policies, you're going to see 20 policies come through, but it's a little bit slower a process than that. And sometimes, like I said, we speed it up based on priority.
Thank you so much for that. It would only be better if it came with like a little how a bill becomes a law and maybe with that, we can go to public comment, and we'll give 1 minute for our public commenters.
If you'd like to speak to this item, please raise your hand. Michelle?
Yes, I just have a clarifying question. Is this time to comment on the actual bill policy of transitional kindergarten?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. One issue that came up recently when it was presented to the Joint Advisory Group is the concern about the staff to student ratio. When we're looking at children in pre-K programs, the ratios are lower, much lower than what is being proposed for transitional kindergarten. And so there's that issue, and also the issue of what will the curriculum be, really wanting many questions rather around, are we moving away from play-based, and what is the plan for making kids quote unquote kindergarten ready? Thank you very much.
Seeing no other hands, Commissioner.
Thank you so much. Do we have questions, comments, thoughts from commissioners? I can go first. If staff could address, I think questions around how curriculum is being decided, and is any of that related to the policy that we're voting on today? as well as the difference in the class sizes for number of students?
So not the curriculum isn't addressed in this policy. The class size is not in comparison to our pre-K, but class size in general is addressed in here to keep us consistent with what's required by California law. One thing I would note, if the commissioners want to have a curriculum discussion or sort of a how are we implementing the policy discussion, probably we should refer that to curriculum committee, and we could invite Chief Yashar, who I promise you will be far more knowledgeable and engaging and interesting than I will on your TK curriculum, because that's not my, I'm not prepared to present to you, nor would you want me to. So if you want to have a more robust discussion like that, we could refer it to curriculum.
Okay, thank you for that advisement. Do commissioners have any thoughts in regards to that? Do you want to leave it up to my discretion?
Commissioner Bogus, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it. I have a perspective on the curriculum side too.
Okay, yeah, I think I think just based on the fact that it's mostly us trying to get in better compliance and alliance with the state, that we do vote to pass it and move it forward. But I think maybe asking if the chair of the curriculum committee would actually kind of bring up this curriculum issue separate. And we can kind of talk about some of the implementations of the policy and any future modifications we kind of want to make. So I don't think there's anything that would prevent us from going back and updating any of these numbers if we felt compelled. Vice President Lamb?
Yes, I had also spoken with Chief Yashar as well as the superintendent about, because transitional kindergarten is a big lift for the district over the next, particularly in the next 3 to 5 years. We are also, as a board, are going to be having to pass a plan by June around transitional kindergarten. So we had discussed at high level a committee as a whole, possibly, because this is a really big topic and issue as a district that we're going to be embarking on. So happy to work with Chair Sanchez on curriculum instruction and thinking through if a committee a whole may be even a better fit for the entire board.
Thank you so much, Vice President Lamb. And I think the only thing maybe I would also ask is if we could have staff present and then also have maybe the joint advisory committees present a little bit on their perspective on the issues and the dynamics, just so we can make sure that their issues are kind of center point of that conversation as well. Any other comments, questions, thoughts for commissioners before we refer this to the whole board for action? Okay, so then I make a motion for us to make a positive recommendation for this item to the whole board.
Go ahead, Commissioner Alexander.
Second.
If there's no dissent, you can also move it by general consensus if that's easier.
I love general consensus.
Okay.
Let's move it forward with general consensus. Thank you so much.
Okay, noted.
Thank you. And with that, let's go to our next and final action item regarding charter schools.
Yeah, so this is also an amendment to your existing policy on charter and with respect to charter school renewal. This is coming out as a direct result of the pandemic, and in non-legalese, it's essentially holding charter schools harmless for test results during the pandemic years, and it gives them an extra 2 years on their charter if their charter was going to expire between January 1st, 2022 and June 3rd, 2025. So it gives them an extra 2 years, and it allows them to look back at only their most recent year of data so that they don't get penalized for data during the pandemic, which, as we all know, is not going to be what we hope it would be for all of our kids. So that's what this policy is doing. And again, it's not really optional. We have to do this as a result of AB 130. But we do try to keep your policies up to date so that staff can look at the existing policy and know what law and procedure to follow.
Clarifying questions from commissioners? Let's go to public comment and we'll give 1 minute per commenter.
If you'd like to speak to this item, can you please raise your hand? Seeing none, Commissioner.
Okay, thank you so much. Any comments or thoughts from commissioners before we take action? Okay, seeing no comment, seeing no objection, I think this is something that we will move forward on general consensus and maintain our compliance with what the state wants us to do. So with that, we will finish this item and we will go to our last item of the night, an informational item on community schools. And I believe there is a slide deck.
Thank you, Chair Bogus. Good evening, Vice President Lamb and Commissioner Alexander. My name is Hongmei Peng, and I'm excited to be joining Deputy Superintendent Myung Lee to staff this committee. We do have a slide deck that is pulling up now. For tonight's presentation, we will be sharing a short presentation. I believe that Chief of Staff, Ms. Jill Hogendijk, and Chief of Family and Student Services, Melanie Lau Smith, is also joining us to help answer questions in the Q&A section. So just to begin, to share a little bit of context, consistent with the district's longstanding commitment, SFUSD has applied in the past for state funding to support community schools and intend to apply in the future. Specific to this item, we have been a long front runner in partnering with community-based organizations to serve students and families in staffing our schools with social workers, nurses, and numerous other positions to support our students and their social, emotional, and physical well-being, along with their intellectual growth. And, as we are hearing, interest in the planning grant application that was released on March 1st, SFUSD staff has reviewed the application and found that as a local education agency with existing community schools, we are currently ineligible for the grant that is open. But we will look ahead to the application window for the implementation grant, whereby the funding can be used to start new community schools, as well as apply to support and expand existing community school programs. Next slide, please. So for today's presentation, with that context, it will be driven by 3 purposes. First, we will provide background information on the community schools model. We will also share an overview of the California Community School Partnership Program and the relevant funding opportunities that were made available this past week. And we will provide a review of the planning grant application. Next slide, please. So to kick us off, a little bit of background. A community school is a whole child school improvement strategy where the district and school work closely with teachers, students, families, and partners. And these strategies can be an effective approach to mitigate the academic and social impacts of emergencies that affect local communities, improve school responsiveness to student and family needs, and to reorganize school and community resources to address barriers to learning. We also have learned that community schools include 4 evidence-informed programmatic practices and environment, which includes integrated support services, family and community engagement, collaborative leadership and practices for educators and administrators, and also extended learning time and opportunities. So under that definition, in 2021, California passed a historic $3 billion funding in the California Community Schools Partnership Program, also known as CCSPP, based on this model. However, these dollars are being appropriated to a range of grant programs over the course of several years. This program supports schools' effort to partner with community agencies and local government to align community resources to improve student outcomes. And they provide an integrated focus on academic, health, and social services, youth and community development, and community engagement. Next slide, please. So for the grant that was presented through the California Community School Partnership Program, there are 4 separate funding opportunities with varying purposes, funding levels, and eligibility criteria, as you see on the screen right now. The planning grant, which is the grant for local educational agencies, also known as LEAs, with no community schools, are awarded up to $200,000 and can be used for up to 2 years. This is the grant that is currently open, but SFUSD is not eligible for due to our existing community schools. We are also looking forward to the implementation grants, which are for new community schools or for the expansion or continuation of existing community schools. These grants are awarded for up to $500,000 annually. I just wanted to note that this grant opportunity is not currently open. Additionally, there are coordination grants for qualifying entities. The California Department of Education will publish coordination grant requests for applications at a later date, and also regional technical assistance center contracts, which are for LEAs that wish to serve as a regional technical assistance center to provide technical assistance to grant recipients who are seeking to establish or expand community schools. Next slide, please. Even though we're not eligible, we did want to provide more of an overview around the planning grant based on our review as we're looking ahead to the implementation grant. Next slide, please. So as you can see, planning grant funding can be used for any of the following purposes that have been outlined here, anywhere from staffing for community school coordinators to being able to, develop partnerships for development and coordination to administrative support. What we want to sort of emphasize is that even though there is a range of purposes, that this grant is not something that we would be able to pursue at the current moment. Next slide, please. To provide an overview of the application process, what you're seeing on this slide is the sort of overview, which includes the funding periods, the funding cycles, and eligibility requirements. We did want to sort of also note that local education agencies cannot apply for both a planning and an implementation grant. And so we have actually looked through the FAQ guidance that was released by the California Department of Education and found this assessment to be very much aligned. And at this time, we are evaluating the planning grant application to assess how the California Department of Education's grant design for subsequent grant programs might roll out and if SFUSD might be eligible for future opportunities. And as we have committed, once it is available, SFUSD stands ready to apply on behalf of our schools if they meet the eligibility requirements specified in the grants. So that concludes the short presentation for tonight. And I will pass it back to you, Chair Bogus, for questions.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Do we have any clarifying questions from board members before we go to public comment? Yes, Vice President Lamb.
Maybe this might be too detailed, but curious around the coordination grant and if it's only LEAs that are eligible to apply, or does it create a broader context like community-based organizations, 501c3s, and or local municipalities?
Thank you so much, Vice President Lamb. I'm actually going to invite Ms. Hugendijk or Chief Lau Smith, if you all would be able to weigh in.
Good evening, everyone. This is Jill Hugendijk. I'm Chief of Staff. I'm scanning the FAQ as you speak. The state just released this last week, and I thought I had read somewhere that it says right here, for the purposes of the planning grant, an applicant must be an LEA.
Clarification. Jill, actually for the coordination grant, which it sounds like it hasn't been released yet.
No, we don't have details about the coordination grant. So,
got it.
yeah. And I do want to add that for the purposes of the planning grant, although we are not eligible to apply, the award is up to and not to exceed $200,000. So these are smaller planning grants.
Right.
Sorry, just as a follow-up then, I mean, certainly I know that staff has already looking at the design once the specifications do come out for such as the implementation grant, I'd also encourage also doing an analysis on the coordination grant, because I know and Chair Bogus has been deeply involved, you know, on the city side as well with SF Rise, and just the opportunities there, should it be eligible to community-based organizations as well as local municipality agencies.
Commissioner Alexander.
Yeah, are we doing, this is clarifying questions, so I'm not sure if this is too big, we can wait till after public comment, but I would love to hear an update on where we're at with the implementation grant. What's our progress in terms of preparing? I know the application doesn't come out until, I think, this week, but I know that we've been you know, in communication with the state, and we've been proactive in not wanting to wait until the application comes out. So I'm just curious in terms of where are we at on that?
And if responding to that, if you could also maybe include what work has been done to kind of reach out to people in our school community to support with the efforts as well.
So we do not have the parameters of the implementation grant, and one of the issues that we've been grappling with, and Melly will have a few more of the details than I do, but at the last grant application round, there was a poverty rate cutoff that meant that there were only a certain number of our schools that qualified to be part of that grant. I know that our UESF and UASF partners have been conducting information sessions. We know that there have been a number of principals that are interested in a community schools grant, but we don't know the crosswalk of where the eligibility criteria are going to meet those sites and site communities that are interested in applying for the grant. So that's one big unknown that we don't have right now. But we've got a small group of people that are ready to rally to help support our school sites. We know that at the last round of grant application, there was a very big lift on the site leader to compile and share information. We do have our RPA partners who will be able to help with the data review and any of those technical aspects that we might need to report. But we are, you know, a lot of the work is going to be dependent on the grant parameters and the eligibility that the state decides to outline.
Chair Bogus, can I ask a quick follow-up? So Chief Hugendijk, I'm just curious, I know that in late January, Leslie, who's the secretary of UESF, sent an email to the board and to the superintendent saying that they had put together a team that was ready to work on the application immediately, even though we don't know all the details. They have somebody from lead, principals, educators, a parent, a student with expertise. Some folks were on the state advisory committee. So I'm just curious, and I know that was forwarded to the superintendent for follow-up. This was on January 25th. So I'm just curious, now that we're over a month after that, like what's been the follow-up on assembling that team?
Well, so Leslie will have more details about the membership of that group, but Leslie, I've had a chance to meet with both Leslie and Jason Hanan, who's our assistant superintendent over cohort 4. So we had a small huddle up just to try to get tactical on some of the next steps and identify, what are the other internal supports that we would need. And then talked a bit about this cross mapping and what steps we would need to take once the eligibility criteria were released to be able to do that follow up with individual sites.
So it sounds like you're ready to go as soon as the application comes out. Is that fair to say?
We are ready to mobilize the small internal team to be able to identify which school sites will be able to will be eligible to apply, and then help organize all of those folks to support that effort. Through the RISE SF initiative, there are a number of work group members there that have also, and I'm not sure how that list might sync up with the list that Leslie has, but we have also received assurances from our partners in the city and folks who are on that work group that they are willing and able to be of support through this application process.
Vice President Lamb.
Thank you. I know we might be talking in broad strokes since we haven't seen the parameters, but just something to know. I'm curious as a follow-up then, if we're talking about grants of 500,000, I think it's helpful to understand, is it 500,000 per site per year, and how many and what that funding cycle is? And I'm curious from CDE's perspective, I mean, sustainability is so important, right? If we look at Promise Neighborhood Centers, if we look at Healthy Start, now I'm going really way back as a former Healthy Start coordinator, around, I think it's particularly important as a district, as we've also talked about our multi-year projections, our financial forecast. I just think it's really important, if we're going to invest in building out initiatives, that we also truly have a sustainable fiscal plan, because what is so harsh for school communities is once those grant funding cycles like sunset. So I just want to put that forthcoming. I know oftentimes we say that, we know it, but I really think it's so important, especially given our financial positions. And this board has been, my fellow commissioners have been deep in it with, for us together in the financial forecasting.
If I may, Commissioner Bogus, may I add something to what Commissioner Lamb said? Thank you, Commissioner Lamb, for that information. And I know the last community schools grant that we applied for, a large part of it was your sustainability plan. What is your plan for when this funding goes away to sustain these services? The funding also cannot supplant, it has to be supplemental. And I did note that in reviewing the planning grant, that is one of the criteria as well. So sometimes you can get, as Jill said, Chief Hogendijk said, the planning grant can give us a little bit of window in what the implementation grant might look like. And my sense would be that a sustainability plan would be a really big part of it. That is very similar to the federal and state funds we get for after school, which was part of the reason when we lost the 21st century funding for high schools a number of years ago. Our sustainability plan was pivoting to fee-based programs, and that is what we did at that point to keep the services. So definitely, I'm glad you raised that. That will be something we'll have to look at very carefully in how we write, when we're thinking of what the implementation grant looks like.
Thank you so much, Molly. And I just, in addition to, I just really ask that it is a high probability fiscal sustainability plan, because I certainly have been a grant writer, have been both a grantee and, really kind of stretch that probability. And I just think in this moment, like our district, I talk a lot about this, but those promises that are made, to our families, to our students and our educators, I just want to make sure that we are able to fulfill those over time. So thank you.
Thank you, staff and commissioners. Why don't we go to public comment now that we've finished with clarifying questions, and we'll give 1 minute per comment.
Okay, if you'd like to speak to this item, please raise your hand. Michelle?
Hi, thank you. Just a shout out for community schools, and really, really appreciative of all the work that's being done by staff and board and people on the ground and our community partners to help make these happen. Thanks.
That's it, Commissioner.
Thank you so much. Any other comments or questions from commissioners? Okay, I can go. I would just say a lot of appreciation for staff, as well as for our kind of community of advocates for community schools. Just really appreciate the way folks have hurried up and waited for them to release things while getting things ready. I know that there was a lot of push from the community and from the board for staff to do this and to reach out. And I'm just really appreciative of the responsiveness of staff and the way that you've really, I think, shown up and kind of put our best foot forward as we get ready to apply for this. So I think a lot of appreciation. I would also say, I think this is going to come back up at our next meeting to kind of have this as a standing item until we kind of get through the application process. And so really just a lot of appreciation to staff and folks in the community that have been helping us through this as we try to get more money to stabilize our schools and really expand and grow what we have to offer students and families. And so I think with that, we will close out this informational item. And we will adjourn our meeting at 6:20 today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so
Good night,
much.
everyone.
Good night.
Wow.
Good night.